There are too many puppets in the mainstream and alternative media. Don't let nobody sell you poisons or lies. Get real honest info. Listen to the Ochelli Effect 5 days a week. And if you want more of the alternative, visit Ochelli.com and think for yourself.
Get ready for the Ochelli Effect. Most underrated voice in all media. The Alternative's alternative. Chuck Ochelli.
And it is the 20th day of June 2017, allegedly, according to that thing we call a calendar. And in some places, they might even describe it as the summer solstice. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, no matter where it is you are or what time it is you're picking this up. I do know that most people do grab it via the podcast at this point. And so I have no idea what time of day you're listening to this, but I will tell you, thanks for joining us. Of course, we're originating live from Ochelli.com, and various other websites are also carrying us, including Autonomous Media. I believe Shake and Wake has us. I think Awake Radio has us. You know, there are a bunch of different places, but Autonomous Media, Shake and Wake, Real Liberty Media. Geez, I can't even list all of what's going on. And some days we're on some networks and some days we're not because they have other programming. But either way, you can catch all of the podcasts in order through Ochelli.com. And we do replay them on the live stream also. By the way, we're also on TuneIn. I don't know if I remembered to mention that last week, but we have the presence on TuneIn now where Ochelli.com runs as 24/7 stream there. And we're going to add some others along with what it is I do. And, we'll get a bit of variety going on that stream very soon. Anyway, it is Tuesday night and it is my privilege to have the two people with me that I do have on Tuesdays. Why? Well, in the first hour, I have Mike Swanson with me, who is the author of The War State. Now, if that's all I had to say about Mike Swanson, that would be quite enough, because I view The War State, the book, it's got a red cover on it. You see Ike sitting there giving his military-industrial complex speech on the cover. I think that this is an extremely valuable book. Why? Because it takes a very, very sophisticated thing and breaks it down so that it is extremely palatable and consumable for people to understand. It doesn't fail to explain the complexities, but it doesn't run you around so that you don't understand what's happened in the evolution of the war state. Anyway, that is one thing that Mike Swanson has done. The other, of course, thewarstate.com, the website is there. That has information on the book, but a great many other things, including an article which I have dropped into the chat, which, again, there's a live chat at Ochelli.com, and I've dropped the link to the article that Mike wrote regarding what he's going to cover on the show tonight. There are various other articles there. He's reposted things about this show. He's part of Neapolis Media Group, etc., etc. And ready? Also wallstreetwindow.com, which is an incredibly informative site about the markets, money, really the overall climate of things regarding finance. Mike was a hedge fund manager for some years, definitely worked in that profession, and is one of those guys who is trying to analyze what's happening as the what I think is chaos, because I don't understand understand it so well, which is why I bring Mike on here a lot to explain some of these things. But great privilege to have him with me at the beginning of Tuesday night in the second half, because we don't fail to keep everybody informed on as many levels as possible. J.P. Sottile, who is the intrepid journalist, carried on many websites, long history in journalism, but also the guy behind newsvandal.com, where you can get the rundown, which is one of the greatest news aggregation tools I have ever witnessed. Now, have I covered everything? I think so. Michael, let me ask you how you're doing tonight, because we've got a lot to cover, and really this is not about my agenda here, but I'm going to have a few things to say regarding some of the subject matter tonight, and it is fascinating to witness how people's news feeds have become compartmentalized too. I noticed that, because we've discussed many times on this show, not with you, Michael, but with many other people, how the algorithms have now changed so that anything is customizable. When you go to YouTube, your viewing history dictates what comes up in your searches, no matter what you're searching for. When you look for news in general, your news feed has been customized. It is all about a normalcy bias, really, because look, if you're constantly looking for politics, they're going to put politics at the front of your news feed. Now, that's a generalized thing, but it also seems to be slanted in various ways. And I find it interesting because some people are very compartmentalized about the information they accept. Okay, with that in mind, because I'm not just throwing it out there as a non sequitur. With that in mind, I want to turn things over to Michael first by asking him, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing really good. And what you just said is something that's been on my mind for quite some time. And I could go on a whole show just about that. In fact, in the middle of last night, I woke up thinking about that, and I'll relate it to something we'll talk about in a few minutes. But, this news cycle really has since the election has picked up speed so fast that, every time we do a show, there's like 5 topics I could talk about, and I got to narrow it down to one and think, well, I'll save some of these others for later. So I thought what I'd really like to touch on is this Putin documentary that Oliver Stone put out, because I watched the whole thing, and it's on YouTube. That's where I watched it. I don't have a subscription to Showtime, and I felt like, well, I better watch it now before it disappears or is taken off YouTube, because it's probably not supposed to be on there. So I recommend anyone who hasn't seen it to go and watch it. I thought at first, how am I going to watch 4 hours of this? But I got sucked in and really found it. I'm not sure what the word is, but it gets your attention. It's entertaining, or it stimulates your mind. I'll put it that way. But before
it's really interesting the way it's out there, and I almost think it's been done on purpose. A lot of things wind up landing on YouTube and then get pulled down, and I think sometimes the companies that actually own the copyrights do that on purpose. Let it float for a little while so that people sort of get a taste of it, and then it's gone. I think that happens, and then it provokes them to subscribe. But I saw I haven't watched the whole thing yet. Okay, and but it is engaging in that we're now looking at somebody who is part of our news cycle on a daily basis. We're looking at somebody who has been part of the overall discussion politically, socially now for the past, decade almost, right? And intensely in the past few years, the discussions, everything from, here we go again, everything from Pussy Riot to did the Russians, screw with the election. It's all been there. And meanwhile, isn't Putin a good guy? Because after all, we have the weak Obama, and look at Putin. He's a manly man, topless on a horseback, and oh my, right? All this stuff, all this propaganda, the rise of RT, it's extremely relevant. So if you care about the information that's going on and a very influential character in global events at this point, you kind of have to pay attention to this, right, Mike?
Yeah, definitely. And how often do you get to watch 4 hours of a world leader, the leader of a nation, in interviews like that. They're done over a period, I think, of 2 years. And, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. I mean, the only thing that perhaps comes close is, there is a series of documentaries done, with John Kennedy when he was president, which are really worth watching. One of them, he's on the campaign trail. Next one, he's in the White House for the first couple months, but each segment is like an hour long. And the third one wasn't so much about John Kennedy, but there was the crisis that took place over school segregation and George Wallace, and it's got more Robert Kennedy in it. But it gives you an unscripted look of President Kennedy, and the camera tries to be in the background. And this actually, I wish I could. I didn't plan this out. I wish I was giving you the title of this thing. But this is actually one of the first documentaries made of this sort where they're trying to be like a fly on the wall. Of course, it's edited, so nothing can really be a fly on the wall. But, Kennedy actually comes off as, a thoughtful person. And, anyway, this is different, because this is one-on-one interviews. This is not anything like that.
Yeah, this is almost reminiscent to me of the Frost-Nixon thing, except the idea is that Nixon wasn't in office when Frost interviewed him, right? And even, Walter Cronkite sat down with Lyndon Johnson, right, for that, amazing sort of little patch of interviews. But all this stuff, there's always an approval process. There's always things that go back and forth, et cetera. Oliver Stone has done this before with a controversial leader. He did a whole thing with Fidel Castro some years ago. And so it's kind of makes sense that he would go and do this. But it is kind of unprecedented in my mind. Maybe I missed it somewhere, to have a world leader that is so pivotal to be interviewed in this sense over a period of time while he's in power. Right. And it's not being run by just his state agency, this kind of thing. Cause, you can put those things aside, right? If the German government is paying to show a documentary on the German chancellor, you don't really expect an unbiased, unfettered sort of, raw view. But, because it's Oliver Stone, you kind of think to yourself, this must be something of interest here. And, it almost makes you wonder why it is a guy like Putin would allow this, because he certainly controls all that kind of stuff very tightly. And also it makes you wonder about the motivations of a guy like Stone. But anyway, we'll put that aside for the moment. It is kind of unique. I mean, I can't think of one. Go ahead.
There's one other that comes to mind that's also actually, I think it's on much of it's on YouTube. And there's a documentary called General Idi Amin, a self-portrait. Now, he was a brutal dictator of Uganda in the 1970s. Tens of thousands of people were killed, under his rule, under his orders. Putin doesn't compare to him, or, really anyone that I can think of at the moment. But this is a documentary made in the 70s, and what happened was the person who did it told the guy, I just want to come over and make a documentary of you, and he agreed to it. And he's so narcissistic that the director told him, well, you're coming off good, this is great. And so the guy just let him keep doing it, and he liked the attention. And you watch this guy is like very demented, and you just have to watch it for yourself. So that's a situation that's the only other thing like this I can come to. Now, Putin, of course, does not come off as a demented person, or I don't think he came off to me as a narcissist. I mean, if you was going to compare Trump and Putin to the Idi Amin guy, Trump is closer to him, because Idi Amin says all kinds of weird, kind of crazy things, and Trump more does that than Putin does. I didn't see anything in 4 hours that made me think Putin's crazy or is saying things that are wild, you know.
Well, but look, in fairness, though, Idi Amin was an African strongman, which there have been many in African nations who have taken over for one reason or another after civil wars, after various genocides, most of which the Western world is fully unaware of. So this is a wholly different character when we're talking about Vladimir Putin. I mean, Carmine and I sat here and went quite a bit through his history on this show and discussed exactly how it is he rose in politics and also in the intelligence community. So this man is going to be extremely measured, is going to be extremely aware of how he's being surveilled, because at the end of the day, when you're being filmed, you're being surveilled. So he's going to be aware of his body language. He's going to be aware of his statements. He's going to be in very, very tight control of his interpreters. This is going to be well staged, whether it is scripted or not, Michael. So, there's going to be a whole different character here when you're talking about an Idi Amin, but it is relevant to point out that Idi Amin was shown. I did forget about that film, by the way, too. You just mentioned it, because that was a pretty wild one when you take a look at what happened. He was just, irrational, and some of the irrational stuff, it was like, no, he was being told, it makes you look very passionate, don't worry. And he was really just acting like a lunatic. But anyway, enough of that. Putin does not come off like a lunatic, like a bad guy, like a strong man, like the individual who, to my satisfaction, has absolutely had journalists killed, has made sure to disappear his family from public view so that no retaliation could be taken against him. Various diplomats who have disagreed with him have died under mysterious circumstances. So, not saying he's guilty of all of it, but assuming that he's guilty of some of it, I think that Putin is a much better chess player than he even portrays himself to be. And we got to keep that in mind when we're looking at now what is going to be publicly disseminated via these interviews, don't you think?
Oh, definitely. And I think probably it's important to point out some of the background of this as you just did. He is not, the way he's been portrayed in the United States is, as you mentioned, people over the past couple of years I've seen on Facebook where people have kind of deified Putin for two reasons. One, in contrast to Obama, in contrast to any American president before Trump got in office, he is measured, he is rational, he's tough and strong, but not doing stupid things, not getting his country sucked into bad wars and so forth. And that's part of the message of RT, that the United States does bad things and for, it's making a mess of the world. And you go back to the Syria, first, what year was it? 2013, I think it was, where there's that crisis where supposedly Assad used chemical weapons, and Obama made a statement at night time to the nation and ended up not bombing them. And Putin put a letter out in the New York Times denouncing American foreign policy and, about this as a reaction to this crisis. And I remember reading that letter and thinking, well, all his arguments are correct. One of the things he would point out was how much of a mess we've made in Libya and Iraq, and we haven't learned from these mistakes. Talking points actually repeated by Donald Trump. Now, the problem is that the people that like this message, that like him for delivering it, don't take into account that why is he saying these things? And I think, that's probably the reason why he did this documentary too. And that reason is to show his side of the global, I'm not going to say we're in a Cold War, because I don't believe that's the case, but his side of the relationship with the United States and the West. and get that message out to us, the American people, so that if there is a crisis or something, we may not take the side of our government and take his side instead.
Well, this is precisely the problem here, because look, just because he's telling the truth does not mean that he is also not simultaneously a heavy-handed dictator. Just because he is telling the truth and he has been extremely efficient when it comes to foreign entanglements, does also not mean that he is not somebody who has oppressed his own people, so on and so forth. The truth of the matter is, after Gorbachev and the Yeltsin debacle in Russia, during the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and all of that going on, Putin has literally put things back together so that they are still a global force to be reckoned with. He has taken back some of the lands and things that, some people were comparing him to Hitler and all this kind of stuff, because he was going back and doing battle to reacquire territory that was lost by the Soviet Union into the Russian Federation. But quite honestly, if you look at this objectively, it doesn't mean that since he's not a smart, brutal dictator, he just because he's a brutal dictator does not mean that he's not a smart, brutal dictator. And, there's a lot to be said about the oligarchs that are involved here, the big money that's involved here, the constant need to deal with Russian organized crime, which did survive the fall of the Soviet Union, believe it or not. The organized crime syndicate survived, not quite as healthy as it once was under, the old Soviet bloc, but it did survive. So all of these things sort of having coalesced back into the Russian Federation, which is very concerned with oil, which is very concerned with the control of resource, which is very concerned with making sure that they keep their business ties in place. You cannot blame him for a lot of the actions he's taken. It doesn't mean that this is the American way, though. And that's the problem here. Strength and standing for your country and things like that does not necessarily mean the same thing in America that it does in Russia. And we witness some of the things that have gone on, and I've even been guilty of saying some kind things about what the Russians have done. To my estimation, they more efficiently did battle with ISIS in 90 days than we have in 9 years on the ground. And I think it's because they actually had a target in mind that wasn't, which assets are being controlled by our military, which assets are being controlled by our intelligence agencies. They had a clear path to who's who over there. So they were able to act much more efficiently in their bombing sorties and things like that. That's my editorialization. You might see it a different way. But there's a lot to be said here, and it is no coincidence that this is surfacing at about the same time that there's a Megyn Kelly interview and that there is much consternation to be had throughout our government regarding the possibility that Russia itself is involved in psychological operations, literal intelligence operations, electronic sabotage and manipulation in order to steer the country or the elections or the sentiment or and so on and so on and so on. I think that this is exactly the way it's supposed to be timed. And again, I remind you, he says even in there, well, I was going to special schools. You think that psychological operations were not part of those special schools? You think that they don't have something quite a bit in line with what we have with the CIA here, where they teach them how to do these things? Guess what? This is who we're dealing with. The head of the CIA effectively is the president in Russia. Okay. Except, it was the FSB and it was the KGB and he's the president sometimes, and sometimes he's something else because he rotates with another guy in order to maintain power. But even so, effectively, think of it this way. A guy who is absolutely forged in the intelligence communities is running the country. So, big surprise, a giant psychological operation with multiple tentacles was launched, including a PR campaign. I don't know, Michael. I know I've taken a lot of time here, but please, object to anything I just said.
Well, on the blog post I made, and people just go to thewarstate.com. It's at the top for this episode. I posted a video that's an interview done by a financial channel called Real Vision, and they typically interview hedge fund managers. And they interviewed this fellow named Bill Browder. Now, he's the son of Earl Browder. That's a name you probably recognize because he was head of the Communist Party in the 50s and 1960s, and Oswald was writing letters to the Communist Party. His name shows up in the Warren Commission and in that whole, Oswald world. But anyway, this William Browder does this interview, and it's like 2 hours long, and I watched this thing when it came out 2 or 3 months ago, and it sucked me right in. I wasn't expecting that I'd sit there and just watch this nonstop. And he tells a story of setting up the first fund that invested in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and how he made all this money. And then it crashed in 1998 when Russia had a crisis and he almost wiped all his investors out. And he decided to stay there and try to make all the money back. And he had investments in all these companies that the oligarchs owned, such as Lukoil, such as Gazprom, their banks, hundreds of them. And what ended up, the story he tells is that when Putin got in power, he decided to do a campaign against corruption, and what that campaign consisted of, in Brower's version, then I'll tell you Putin's version, which he gives in the documentary. But Browder makes it like it was a shakedown campaign, and Putin jailed some of them, perhaps killed people associated with them, a couple, to make examples out of them, and then forced all of the remaining ones to give him interest in all the companies that they owned. Now, this is actually what went on in Egypt under the dictatorship there that what was his name, Mubarak, had for a couple decades. Mubarak owned about 10% of all of the stock in every company in Egypt. So Browder is asserting that this is essentially what Putin has done. Now, what happened to Browder is that as Putin was doing this, Browder himself was engaged in his own campaigns against certain oligarchs that he claimed were ripping him off, and Putin was using that to support his own campaigns. Like they were not working together in a way.
Michael, to give people a general sense, let's just make something very clear, and I think this is a concise way to put it. There was a bit of a financial civil war that broke out when the fall of the Soviet Union occurred. There was a fire sale of a lot of assets, intelligence assets, hardware, you name it, from various nations that suddenly found themselves foreign nations to the Soviet Union. There was a bit of chaos, and out of that were many opportunists who came in, and some of them were domestic opportunists who tried to consolidate the wealth that could be consolidated, and they did it in an interesting time, and there were many foreign, let's call them economic hitmen because it's the best term I know of, the foreign guys that came in and manipulated the situation and really sucked a lot of the wealth of the country dry. This left a lot of resentment among, well, I don't know, Soviet loyalists, Russian loyalists. I'm not sure how to describe them because they had felt quite betrayed. Now, this simultaneous with the political actions of the Clinton administration, basically, even though they promised, and the Bushes also promised not to encircle Russia, what did they do? They utilized NATO and the weakening of the Warsaw Pact to do exactly that, to encircle Russia in a military sense. And also there were actions taken that basically were counterproductive for the Soviet / Russian people during this transitional time period. So there was an inner struggle and an outer struggle both going on simultaneously. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and definitely Putin obviously has come out on top. Now, the Browder story is that they have falling out, and Putin targets him and his businesses and arrests one of his associates who ends up in jail and dies and so forth. But it's just a compelling story, and I take it as it's worth. I'm just suggesting it's worth watching the Oliver Stone documentary and then watching this other documentary along with it back to back to get to a different side of Putin. Not that Stone's covering things up, but just a different angle of what's going on. To me, watching the Oliver Stone thing, there's two interviews I saw Stone give over the past couple of days about it. The first one was on Fox with this Tucker Carlson character, and he all he wanted to say was, well, Oliver Stone, you have left-wing people attacking you. This is how bad the left is. That's they didn't talk about the show at all. The other interview Stone gave was on CBS with the morning show of that Charlie Rose is on, and they essentially attacked Oliver Stone for even doing this, saying Putin's lying, Putin hacked the election, implying, this is really terrible. And in the mainstream media, that seems to be like everything has to be filtered into our domestic politics. And I think more interesting, to me than trying to make a judgment of Putin, is he a bad person or a good person? And, these kind of am I supposed to like him or not? And, just see what is he actually saying? Did I learn anything from it? And I actually, say I did. The fourth show, was interesting because the third one, Oliver Stone talked about Edward Snowden and had, how bad NSA hacking is. And
but before we go there, because I didn't even get that far, so I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about it, and I am going to follow up and watch this, believe me. But the thing is that just going into the first two parts, and I did not even fully feel as though I absorbed all of it. I'll say this: there is this default position with politics here in America at this point, and I think it's a worldwide phenomena. They just use slightly different titles, where they feel as though there is literally a clear-cut left and a clear-cut right. And look, I'm standing on this side and they're on that side. The truth is that this doesn't really match any of the definitions previously given. The left, if you were to ask somebody about the left in the 1980s or the left in the 1970s or the 1990s even, you would think that they would be absolutely sympathetic to Russians, Soviet leaders, et cetera, et cetera. They would be apologetic of Soviets and things like that because they're on the left, and left is communism, isn't it? And this was also a ridiculous default position, but it was a whole lot more clear-cut than it is today. It seems as though those who claim to be on the right are actually quite a bit more apologetic for a guy like Putin, for communist nations, one way or another, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what it all boils down to is we've been lied to about the real agenda regarding how this fits into our politic. For the most part, it doesn't. This guy is pulling things together, Putin, in my estimation, for his nation. He's a nationalist. This I can say quite succinctly. He's a nationalist. There are many nationalists who are more concerned with their own nation than others, and we could argue about how far that needs to go before it gets to be, insanity. But The thing is that it is reasonable to cut him a break there. But when we look at the propaganda that's been put out to try and sell this guy as a good guy, as more American than the American president, as more of an honest person, he's going to actually tell the truth about things. Well, yeah, when it's politically convenient and profitable for him to do so, sure he will. And he's not making bad points. He's making very logical points. He's just controlling which points he's making. Again, the mark of a very, very wise intelligent asset. Don't tell them the whole story. Just tell them the part of the story that you need to relate in order to create the result. And this has been done. Now, we move into the Snowden
we know
thing.
how it works because we've seen it. We've actually, started the Kennedy assassination. You actually, at some point, look back and you say, goodness, so you know what I'm saying.
Well, I don't want to say that America
go down that road, but you know what I mean.
I don't want to say that America needs to take credit for it, but we certainly had something to do with the development of that playbook. Okay, it may not be our playbook, but we certainly helped write it. So this is not something that's unusual, interesting, Soviet only, Russian only, Putin only. It's just that this is the way business is done.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of the intelligence business. So we get into Snowden now in the third part, and that's got to be real fascinating. So please go ahead and tell me about it, because I have no idea what he said about it.
Well, it's not. Stone brings up Snowden and Putin. What's the most interesting thing isn't so much Snowden himself, but just the general issue of hacking and NSA spying, and Putin really has no problem with it. Snowden is in Russia. Obviously, he's using him, sort of as a propaganda card, but the way they describe how he ends up in Russia is sort of like an accidental thing. It sounds believable. This is the story that Snowden has taught Oliver Stone, and Putin agrees with it. But Putin says that Snowden did the wrong thing. He should have just quit, and not, shared the secrets, basically. But what's more interesting is just the general thing of spying and hacking, and Putin basically says the U.S. shouldn't spy on we shouldn't spy on our allies. And what he's basically said, it's more like a pragmatic thing. And one thing that comes across to me is Putin claims that he's looking ahead, 20, 30, 50 years ahead, and that the United States is not. And we have a very short-term view, and all this seems reasonable to me, and this is why he doesn't say this, but it makes you conclude that this is why we engage in things that may be counterproductive. So this could be an example. Some of the wars could be an example. And
but now, in fairness, Michael, here's something interesting here to me. In fairness, when he's saying, well, listen, I think he did the wrong thing about revealing state secrets. Now that is the signal he's got to send. He doesn't want to encourage his own people to start swacking. Right. So he's got to say that. There's no choice there for him saying, well, he's not really that bad of a criminal. I mean, we have him here. He just hasn't figured out an adequate way to really use him. That's what it comes down to. And is he going to say that in an interview with Oliver Stone or Megyn Kelly? I mean, come on. Well, I haven't actually decided how I'm going to utilize this fool that I have in my country now, because he's an enemy in his own country, so I have him at my mercy, and as soon as I can utilize him the right way. And meanwhile, Snowden didn't tell us anything that we kind of didn't already know, suspect, or have some evidence of. I am always suspicious of that whole thing, because we kind of knew about the spying. We kind of knew about domestic surveillance. I certainly knew about the NSA ramping it up post 9/11 for sure. And I'm not an intelligence asset, although I did at one time apply for a job with the NSA. I say again, but I never got the job. I applied for a signals analyst position. Anyway, moving forward, there is there's nothing to be gained by him demonizing the guy or making him seem as though he's some great prize because he hasn't been able to utilize him. And all he is now is a chip, a potential problem. And that's it. That's it.
Well,
so what else is he going to do with him except say, look, it's not good to dump your nation's secrets out to the world, right?
Well, there's a couple interesting things he says. One, with regards to the United States, what we're doing in the world, Putin says that we have an objective, that our government has an objective in all these foreign policies, but he won't say what it is. He says, I'm going to reveal that in a book when I retire, which I thought that was a funny comment. But Oliver Stone, in these interviews, he's concerned, almost scared, I would say, about the potential for nuclear war and also the potential for some sort of computer hacking crisis. And Putin sort of dismisses both of these concerns, which is the same sort of thing as you're speaking about Snowden. You know, it's not his role to be alarmed, right? That would be the last thing he would want to portray as any sort of nervousness or alarm. But the computer hacking thing was interesting because Oliver Stone talked about some sort of virus that we used to screw up the Iranian nuclear program several years ago. And
he went to Stuxnet, didn't he?
Yeah, and he's talked about the Stuxnet virus and all this kind of stuff. And Stone brought up the possibility that the United States has the capability to actually shut down a nation's whole computer system, and he asked him basically, are you scared of that? And Putin dismissed those worries, and he made the comment, first of all, during this, he denies that he hacked the election, as Stone put it, and as the U.S. media puts it, hacked the election, you know. But if you look back at last year, there was more going on than hacking the election, whatever that phrase is even supposed to mean.
Well, with only the limited paperwork that has, been circulated now because of Reality Winner, I still shudder when I say that name. Reality Winner having come out and made photocopies of certain things, that is actual evidence, in my estimation, that there was a lot more going on. Always there's a lot more to the story. Were they hacking the election? Well, what was the first defense of the trumpets, right? Well, nobody actually tried to get into voting machines or databases. They did. But anyway, this is not anything unusual either. This is the thing. It kills me because it seems like there is a constant, little tiny skirmishes going on here. The truth is that, again, if you fired these giant, shutdowns and viruses into other people's networks and everything else, you're gonna have a problem here. It's really like it comes almost right to the nuclear question, where you have mutually assured destruction. Okay, because realistically, if you crash a huge part of the internet, let's just say, because everything goes haywire in a nation that's utilizing it, and their systems go down, a whole lot of cascading events can occur that'll eventually get back to you. I don't think anybody can profit from doing that except on small scales, very targeted things. So, it's kind of a misunderstood idea at this point. And as far as nuclear weapons go, I'm more worried about the fact that we've constructed things that are deteriorating, and nobody's talking about that. These assets that are all over the place that nobody quite knows where all of them are. There's a bunch of things missing. Even from the fall of the Soviet Union, there's nuclear assets that were never inventoried, right? I mean, there's a lot of broken arrows out here that can easily end up stuck in somebody's side. And it's a dangerous world. It's just that simple. For Stone to be alarmed about these things and for Putin not to be, to me, this is, again, a non-story, because Putin's not going to get alarmed even if he has a need to be alarmed. That's just not productive.
what was interesting about the discussion about the hacking is that if you go, this wasn't a documentary, but if you go back to last year during the election, there was a news story in Reuters or New York Times somewhere that the Pentagon computers were hacked. The story was they were like computers that weren't that important, like a low-level classification system, and they were hacked. And the story asserted that this was just a show, that it was sort of a warning signal. And this was before Election Day. This was in the news. Now, Putin makes the statement that he went to the United States, or his government contacted U.S. officials about trying to come up with ground rules about cyber warfare and what's permissible, what isn't, and the United States rebuffed him. So based on that statement alone, I would assume or make a conclusion that Russia did things last year, maybe not to elect Donald Trump, as Rachel Maddow asserts, in a plot. Who knows what's going on with, Trump's business associates and all that. JP Sottile on that story. But I would just say that if you just forget about the election, in the summer, it didn't look like Trump was going to win anyway. And whether Trump wins or loses, just by Putin doing stuff of some sorts, playing at the Pentagon computers or doing this and that, he's sending a message that we're escalating, basically, or responding to what the U.S. is doing. And that's basically his message throughout the whole documentary, is the U.S. has done this. The U.S. has expanded NATO. The U.S. has meddled a little bit in my election in 2012. So everything the Russians do is a reaction. The U.S. has meddled in Ukraine. He's reacting. And this is actually typical of foreign relations with countries. If you have a dominant power and then another major power that's being interfered with or feeling disturbed by the other power, they come back and they'll create a crisis. They'll react to try to create a final crisis that will lead to a settlement or some sort of agreement. That's basically what Khrushchev was attempting to do, but failed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, it could be what's going on in North Korea, or it could be what happens in China with the South China Sea or some other hot flashpoint. And Putin himself in this show makes a comment that he shows he's not worried about anything going on. They talk about a couple incidences, but he makes a statement that there could be a big crisis, coming in a couple years or in 10 years or so, something to that effect. So,
but see, that's why it's worth the investment to undermine the legitimacy of statements coming from the American mouth one way or another. And the mouth right now is Trump. So, actually I could see how he would be the preferable candidate. I could see exactly how that works from a public image standpoint. Look, he was stronger than Obama, and he's a whole lot more sophisticated and stable than Trump, period. So guess what? When we have these again, and again, because this is a repeated theme in the news lately, Russians are now considering our planes legitimate targets in Syria. And look, we've had encounters and possible very near misses on hostilities with Russian assets for the past several years. But now, you see, if something does go wrong, and Putin, who's calm and cool and makes statements that make sense, comes out and says, hey, look, this is the way it was, how's that going to play on the world stage compared to Trump, who comes out and goes, they're bad. They're just bad people. And Putin is not a bad guy, but this pilot must have been bad. If he comes out and says something like that and Putin goes, look, this is the way it was. My pilot was engaged, and we just have one clash. They will win in the war of public opinion worldwide right away, based on the fact that we have this guy who makes irrational and erratic statements, and Putin is not irrational and erratic. You can say many things, but he is very, very steady in his performances and his appearances and his policy. Okay, consistency is something that he does absolutely exude. So, when you consider all that, what are we left with, Michael? I think a giant psychological operation to undermine the legitimacy of American leadership has definitely been successful, and I think this is the way it works. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong all the way around, but this is very much business as usual. Just one problem: the saber rattling that used to have to be done in public through approved propaganda outlets like the New York Times and CBS News, okay, now gets done some of it behind the scenes. And now it's like, hey, look, the NSA doesn't release every cyber attack that has been launched against the nation or its infrastructure. We're not going to know about all of them, but those guys do. And the people that are getting briefed do. So guess what? They know when the Russians have done whatever, and now they have to play the game when something is leaked, which sometimes it's strategically leaked, so that they have to play the game about who's actually responsible for it, what's actually going on. Is it just some fat guy on a bed in a basement somewhere, or is it a concerted, Russian intelligence action? To my mind, these things have been far too sophisticated and far too well sustained to be anything but backed by a larger government entity. And again, I know very well that we do not have all of the information in the public domain to recognize the full breadth, if you will, of the threat. So we're almost out of time, but how would you wrap this up? I know I interrupted you a lot, as I always do, but Well,
this is my concern. I've said this a couple shows ago, is that Russia and China also are prepared for a crisis with the United States at some point in the future. I don't know if it's next month or 10 years from now, that we could overreach somehow, and they've positioned themselves to be the rational actors. And with China this weekend, there's a story, again, one of the three major newspapers, that the Chinese premier and the Chinese government have so far done absolutely nothing to help Trump or the U.S. with the situation in North Korea. They have not reduced the amount of money and aid and assistance they're giving to the North Korean government at all. So they're doing nothing. So we don't know everything that's going on, but the problem is what Putin has is the ability to, by being one person, unfortunately, it gives him an advantage, being this leader of decades of experience, more of an authoritarian leader, to be level-headed and plan ahead, where Trump, he doesn't seem to have much power and has given a lot of it up in regards to the national security state. And as Putin says in the documentary, and the bureaucracies are really what rule. He makes a statement that bureaucracy rules the world. And what's funny is even in Russia, they don't make a big deal out of this in the show, but he's actually making his system more bureaucratic. He's created a National Security Council like we have in the United States, where the people meet on a weekly basis, with him there. So he's taking steps to do that.
But see, every head of every single aspect of government has to meet with him. Okay.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So all roads lead to Putin there. Here, on the other hand, we have a bit of chaos. And the reason why we have a bit of chaos is because somebody who doesn't know how to run that infrastructure is allegedly in charge.
Well, there's a story today that says that Trump is meeting one-on-one with General Mattis, Secretary of Defense, on a regular basis, and no one else, no other generals, besides his national security advisor, but no one else in the Pentagon or the military, or just Dunford, the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, just those two.
But I object to that story. Wait a second. I object to that story entirely, and I'll tell you why. Because we also are aware of the fact that he has basically acquiesced civilian control over the Pentagon to the Pentagon, which is constitutionally an invalid thing to do by the president anyway. We're supposed to maintain civilian control over the military because the military's agenda is not necessarily in the best interest of the entire nation. I need people to understand that, okay? And it's a dangerous thing that he's done there. He's meeting with his individual trusted cabinet members and what have you and so on and so forth because supposedly he's afraid of leaks. That's a different thing than really streamlining control, Michael. And I don't know about you,
I agree with you. I think it's doing the opposite. Yeah, I agree that's a mistake. That's a whole other discussion, but
listen, you and I have studied Kennedy enough, and we're down to the last couple of minutes, but let's just make a point about Kennedy real fast. If Kennedy had done the same thing, we would have went to war in Germany. We would have went to war over Cuba. We would have been involved in a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. We would have directly engaged the Soviet Union on several fronts in Europe. We would have actually attacked a couple of European nations who seem to be acting against our best military interests. I can count 10 different wars in Kennedy's 3 years in office that would have gone on if the generals had control over the situation, not to mention things like Operation Northwoods and a whole bevy of contingency plans that would have been signed off on by those very same generals. Do you object to what I'm saying here?
Oh, no, you're right. And the problem that makes this bad is that Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, served in Afghanistan. So he's got a vested interest in what goes on there because he was a part of it. And now we have a decision on how many troops to send there. So, he's biased to do that. He doesn't want to admit that it's a mistake or shouldn't, that we need to give up. So there you go.
That's the absolute truth. Michael Swanson, again, the author of The War State, the guy behind WallStreetWindow.com, and also TheWarState.com. In case you didn't see it in the chat room at Ochelli.com, there is a link to an article that covered, most of what we got to tonight, although I interrupt Michael a lot, so that's what happens on the show. But hopefully we'll continue this discussion next week. Sir, I do appreciate you dropping in and doing this with me and putting up with my interruptions. Because,
it's fun.
I try to have fun. Anyway, we'll have a little more fun with JP Sottile in the next hour, so stay tuned to the Ochelli Effect. We'll be right back. Second hour beginning here, broadcast live from the facilities of Ochelli.com. Of course, many of you are catching it later on down the stream via your fondle slab of choice, your applicable application, etc. We do welcome you no matter how it is you're tuning in. We're also carried live on various networks, and we do appreciate them as well. Let them know if you love it or hate it. Please message them and also use the contact form at Ochelli.com and let me know what you think, because bottom line is I'm going to read all of it. And also, I want to remind people that whatever goes on this show effectively is the responsibility of the presenters and me, nobody else. So you want to complain about it, really, you ought to come to me about it. And if you want to complain to the presenters, some of them appreciate emails. I know JP Sottile at newsvandal.com must receive a lot of emails on a daily basis like I do. And a lot of other contacts. He is the intrepid journalist, which you can find his writing in a lot of places right now. Past works over at, Consortium News, Truth Out, the Anti-Media. These are the ones I always mention, but there are many outlets that carry JP's work, as well as going over to newsvandal.com, signing up for the rundown, which is the most effective news aggregation tool I have ever seen across the spectrum. So we're still live on a Tuesday at the moment again, and do appreciate all you guys for tuning in. JP, there's so many directions we could go in tonight, my friend.
Pick one.
Pick one.
We need like a wheel of topics, and you can spin it at the beginning of the show, and we just go with it. We got what? We've got this, and people listening on the podcast, they will probably know what the outcome is in the Ossoff-Handel race, the special election to replace Tom Price, who is over at HHS, Health and Human Services, Dr. Tom Price, Republican, who took that seat from Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, who has become quite a mouthpiece for Donald Trump now that Callista has been given a ambassadorship, essentially ambassadorship to the Holy See at the Vatican. Tom Price, who is managing the administration's healthcare, whatever it is. Donald Trump has said to the senators now, after touting out in the Rose Garden the passage of the House version of Ryan Care or Trump Care, depending on whether you're talking to Trump or Ryan. I think when you're talking to Trump, it's Ryan Care. If you're talking to Ryan, it's Trump Care. Touting it as a wonderful achievement with beer and all kinds of glad handing and backslapping, went on to say about a week ago that it was mean, and then has gone on to say that we need to have a bill with more heart. It's got to have some heart in it. We're not saying whose heart it needs to be. Obviously, somebody's going to have to be sacrificed to get the heart that then can be burned and to the god in an Aztec ritual, which is, I'm sure, what Donald Trump has in mind. But so Tom Price, who has profited mightily over the years particularly off of medical devices, writing little bills and putting riders into bills that give huge benefits to little targeted medical companies that he just so happens to have investments in, and investments that are made conspicuously right around the same time that he puts these little riders into bills to make those companies more profitable. He says it's all on the up and up because he never knows how those trades are made because it's given over to sort of not a blind trust, but it's managed by a broker with whom he has no communications. It's just that I think it's a female, this woman has such incredible just gifts. She has a preternatural gift for knowing how to invest his money. It just so happens that she coincidentally makes investments right around the time that Tom Price is making these changes to federal legislation that would benefit the stocks that she purchases for him. So this is Georgia 6. This is the story du jour. The $50 million, I think, something upwards of $50 million spent, the most expensive congressional race in the history of congressional races. And I have to admit that I'm somewhat nonplussed by the whole thing. I mean, this has been a Republican district now for like 30, 40 years. If this kid Ossoff does win, it will mean something, but the one funny thing, and then I'll shut up. The one funny thing I did hear today was a reporter, I think for the Atlanta Constitution-Journal, down there in the district talking to voters, and the question is whether these swing voters, these Republicans who are not Trumpsters, will cross over, because this is pretty much an affluent, upscale, predominantly Republican district. If some of these people will cross party lines and vote for Ossoff or stay home, either one would be a net bonus for Ossoff. And what this reporter said was, well, yeah, there are a number of issues there. Ossoff being a carpetbagger because he doesn't live in GA5. He lives across the border in GA. He doesn't live in GA6. He lives across the border in GA5. He's also young. He's untested, blah, blah, blah. And the reporter said, well, none of these things are really issues for a lot of these swing voters. Really what it is if anything, they want to send a message to Washington about Trump, which is funny because I think Trump was sent to Washington to send a message to Washington. So in 6 months, we've gone from sending Trump to send to Washington to send a message to Washington to people in the Republican Party saying they want to vote against Trump by voting for Ossoff to send a message to Washington, which just leads me to this infinite jest of people sending messages to Washington. You might as well put your legislative wish list in a bottle and drop it in the Gulf of Mexico for all the good it's going to do you.
Okay. Now let me give you a little bit of insight from a unique perspective, because I'm in Georgia. All right. Now, I don't sound like I have the Georgia accent, I know, but it is where I am.
Forget about it.
Forget about it. I'm in the north side of Georgia. Georgia. The bottom line is that when Trump was running, I want to tell you something. The flyers that were sent out, and I'm not even a registered voter in the state of Georgia. The last state that I registered in was North Carolina. Previous to that, I registered in New Jersey. And I have not cast a vote for president since Clinton. I've told you this before. Okay. But I'll tell you this, I watched what came out, what was mailed to people, what was happening down here while the election was going on. The Republican Party did not have the giant Trump banner on their get out and vote stuff in Georgia when he was running. I want you to know that. The mailers that you saw in other states with the big, golden Trump letters and all that Trump Pence, right, did not go out in the mail in Georgia. Okay? They didn't want to own this guy, really. They are staunch Republicans throughout this state. The majority are. It's almost drawn perfectly, by the way, according to racial lines in a lot of districts, I got to tell you, which is why gerrymandering is so important, an issue for another day. But the people that are in poorer districts that happen to be, what you would consider non-whites, don't vote for the Republicans. Everybody else seems to. Okay? And by default. So they didn't want to push the Trumpster here in Georgia. But once he was elected, Republican politicians have spoken as if this is their guy. He is the absolute, answer. And yeah, he's not exactly what we would have wanted, but he is what we have, and we're happy with him. And this changed. Now, looking at this situation between these two politicians, there are super PACs that have come in to the tune of 20 million and 25 million each, the two most highly publicized ones. So that's 45 million from super PACs alone.
And one of those is Paul Ryan's super PAC.
That's correct. Yeah. So what does that tell you? Why in the world? This is the question that a lot of people keep asking. And it's been an interesting race, by the way, because they have even run commercials here talking about the violent left shooting congressmen, which is a commercial that now everybody's trying to disown because it's just absolutely outlandish that they were trying to utilize the shooting of the congressman at the baseball game practice, as a political issue. Because John Ossoff supports people that do things like this. Literally, that's pretty much what the campaign ad says. I want you to know.
And these ads, the reason they come out is because they work.
Oh, they do work. They do work. And as much as everybody pulled it back and disowned it and whatever, it's you can't put the poop back in the horse. You know what I'm saying? Yep. So once it happens, it happens. It's out there. Right? This has been really hotly contested. It's been very strange to watch, and even stranger given the fact that you have a GOP candidate who says things like, I am not for the living wage. A living wage, I'm not for it. There are people that are pro-abortion, which we need to stop. They are hateful and violent pro-abortion people. I mean, weird rhetoric that you think is just too far gone for common sense is workable in the state of Georgia. I don't know how far I want to comment because, I'll get knocks on my door next. Because
well, what you were pointing to is something that I didn't intend to really bring up tonight because I was interested. There are a lot of things going out there. I know you talked a lot with the great Michael Swanson about the Putin interviews. I did watch a couple hours of that. We could talk about that a little bit. But I think actually Putin, that does intersect with something here, oddly enough. which is tribalism. And you talk about Georgia, and I did follow this Georgia race, and there was a moment there, end of August, beginning of September, when the Democratic Party thought, wow, we might actually have a shot in Georgia, because the demographics of Georgia are changing quite a bit. Georgia is not what it was 20 years ago, and in no small part because of CNN, the power of CNN to draw people in, how it has transformed Atlanta, and also Coca-Cola is there, and you have a very cosmopolitan mix formulating around. There's the Beltway, right? I can't remember I've been to Atlanta a couple times, the Beltway freeway around Atlanta. I can't remember the number, but when you around that Beltway, and you're talking about, isn't this like DeKalb County and Fulton County and Cobb County? These are places that are becoming much more like other metropolitan cities in blue states that they are like the staunch and sort of red belt strongholds of Donald Trump in red states.
But see, that's Atlanta, right? And Atlanta is not the whole of the state of Georgia.
No, I agree. But in terms of population density, this is where we are as a society, where you have the population density in these more metropolitan areas, but you have a disproportionate amount of, in a sense, power and influence in places that are not as heavily populated because of just the sort of the oddity of the way things are gerrymandered, as you pointed out, and the way the system works, the way the system is set up. But so Georgia it's an interesting place. It's got this interesting mix, but you pointed out that the Republican Party was not embracing Donald Trump until he won.
That's right.
And that gets to this idea of tribalism. And there is tribalism on both sides, folks. There's tribalism on a dozen different levels. And I think the one thing that I find more than anything in not just the United States, but in the world at large, is a retrenchment into ethnic, religious, and tribal identities, and a willingness to forego any kind of sense of consistent moral or ethical practice in the interest of loyalty to one's tribe.
Well, right. Now, let me take it right outside of the United States with a current event, okay? We have the attacks in the UK. All right, we have the attacks at London Bridge, the building near Parliament. We have that concert. Okay, these are attacks which are described as terrorism.
Yep.
These are attacks which cause a great deal of news coverage worldwide. Correct. Doesn't matter how many people were killed. This guy comes wielding a knife, and it's a big event.
Yep.
Okay. Et cetera, et cetera. Then a guy who it seems like just decided to retaliate for said attacks and decided to target Muslims. Well, this was kind of covered for a minute in the U.S.
Oh, and by the way, you know what he was called? He wasn't called a terrorist. He was called a vigilante.
A vigilante.
That's the word that I saw numerous times today when I was collecting on the rundown. Vigilante. What are we going to do about vigilante violence? So what you make that sort of that very knowing sort of sigh, that sort of telling sigh. Why? Because vigilante is somebody who is trying to achieve justice outside of the normal boundaries of legal jurisprudence or judicial process. So,
right. To take it to your childhood, Batman is a vigilante because
Batman's vigilante.
You know what I'm saying? He is outside the law. He's obviously not using legal procedures. He may turn people over to the law afterwards, but he's actually getting vengeance on the streets over some really bad dudes. Okay, and he's kind of justified, and that is the weird thing here, is it was kind of justified once they figured out that, it wasn't a Muslim attacking Muslims or something odd like that. We saw the same thing in Canada not long ago, the attack on a mosque. Okay,
which
now
came and went, just disappeared.
But why? Well, because it violates the tribalism, the nationalism that people are worried about en masse. And this is the thing. It's so frustrating. A murder is a murder, okay? An attack is an attack. Terrorism is an asymmetric attack against a population. Point blank. It does not matter what the sentiment is. The Vietnamese and the Americans have participated in, terrorism. There have been various instances of what I would consider terrorism that were conducted by various individuals, some of them politically motivated, some of them ethnically motivated, some of them religiously motivated. It is irrelevant. Terrorism is terrorism. Why is it that this becomes a vigilante or a response or...
Okay, but wait. Let's put a much finer point on this. Because if we're going to go down this rabbit hole, let's do it. Because this is something that this is a bug that's been up my rear end for a long time.
Good. Because I want you to sharpen this point, JP, because I've been trying to make it in a lot of different ways, and I think I've kind of failed. I really do. So go ahead.
Let's go to another one here. There was an attack just 3 days ago, in the West Bank. It was, I believe, it was a knife attack, and it was Palestinian on Israeli. And after the attack, the Islamic State claimed responsibility, and this was thought to be initially, this is the first time the Islamic State has launched an attack or claimed inspiration for an attack inside West Bank, Gaza, or Israel. That's been one of the oddities, right? How is it that the Islamic State has never attacked Israel? People wonder this stuff. So here it was, it came out. Then, whoa, both Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, both came out and said, wait a minute, Islamic State, you don't know what the heck you're talking about. This had nothing to do with you. This was us. This was not you.
Yeah.
Okay. So why do I bring that up? It's because here's the thing. Is it terrorism if a deranged or angry or unhinged individual goes out and wreaks havoc on human beings, killing some of them, maiming them, whatever he does? Is it terrorism if that person is not part of a coordinated organizational effort to engage in an asymmetrical attack against a numerically or materially superior enemy? I say no.
No, it's not. Right.
Is it an attack if the person does not have a manifesto or political aim or some sort of historical superstructure within which they are trying to effect some kind of response? I say no. That's why I think Dylan Roof, who went into the South Carolina church and gunned down black parishioners, is terrorism. Why? Because he stated on more than one occasion after committing the act that he did it because he wanted to start a race war. That right. Is, even though it's not associated with an overall group, is essentially an attack, a terrorist attack, because it has an identifiable political aim inside a psychohistorical paradigm, which is race war. He wanted to spark a race war. That right. To me is far more like a terrorist attack than the guy up there in Portland, and I can't remember his name, and it's a name that I should remember because I remember the name that stood out, who stabbed a couple people trying to attack Muslim girls on a it was a bus, right? I think it wasn't a train, it was a bus. I can't remember. And he said, oh yeah, he's obviously unhinged. He's obviously deranged. He goes into an open court setting and says, I'd do it again, and I hope they all died. This wasn't, some people call this terrorism. This is patriotism. Well, was it for any specific reason, or was it because this guy was like the guy that went to the UPS facility here a week ago and shot people because he was angry about overtime. Or any person who goes and kills people out of some act of vengeance or because they have a personal narrative within which engaging in violence assuages some part of their psychology. Is that terrorism? I don't think that's terrorism. Okay,
now I need to interject here because I am going to disagree with you about this guy in Portland, and I'll tell you why. There is a political superstructure which is in place, which is not necessarily the kindest thing to mention in public, that makes it totally acceptable, to commit these types of acts, and that they are a coming horde that need to be dealt with, that this is the only way you're going to preserve your nation and your race. Yeah. This is something that is an ideology. It is contained in that ideology. It is pushed in a rhetorical sense. It is pushed in a propaganda sense by more than one individual. I'm not going to identify them, but I'm going to tell you, JP, there is huge organizations that are engaged.
I know. And Portland is a place that has a history of this. This is where the Metzgers, Tom Metzger and his son, were put on the map.
Next point I was going to bring up. Yes,
right.
Exactly.
White Aryan resistance. They beat I think it was an Ethiopian student who was in Portland, beat him to death. And, they both had, I think they both went to jail. I know Tom Metzger went to jail for inciting it. And, there's these were skinheads, basically. This is, white nationalism as it sort of grew up out of, really sadly, the punk movement on the West Coast in the early 80s and metastasized into white Aryan resistance and other things, and then turned into the Christian identity movement, which was in Hayden Lake and so on and so forth. So there is this is where we are. There is a line here. So I'm going to say that the congressional shooting, I don't see that as an act of terrorism. I see that as an act of a deranged individual because, so it's difficult, right? Because on one level, I'm trying to have it both ways with Dylan Roof and with the congressional shooter and with the Portland stabbing. But at least we know that there is a gray area here where there is a discussion to be had, because I'm not sure that one guy with a knife stabbing somebody and screaming Allahu Akbar is terrorism.
See, now neither am I, but here's the thing. When you have a superstructure of rhetoric and heated political discussion that is being irresponsibly pushed, you're going to have to assume as a speaker, and I think about this all the time with every word I speak, and I know that you measure your words very carefully.
Of course.
For the same reason, because we know this much. Guaranteed at some point someone who is unhinged is going to get a hold of a heated statement from one of us. Guaranteed that they are going to mix that in with some belief system, some ideology, whether it is warped or not, whether it is exactly as some people have laid it out, codified by people like the Metzgers or not. One way or another, we know that we must take care to use our rhetorical ability to speak, in a responsible manner. I'm sorry, but I see these things as being inspired. There is some responsibility to be had by those who do inspire them. Now, does it mean that it is something that should be called terrorism and categorized as such? Not always. Not always. Obviously, the guy who shot up the UPS building terrorized some people, literally, but it wasn't a political point that was meant to be had. It wasn't an act of war, effectively. It was lashing out at individuals at a particular place.
Okay, but Chuck, can an individual who's not attached to an organization engage in an act of war?
Well, gee, isn't that the major question here?
And that's the thing. And this is why, at least with Dylan Roof, he had a political agenda which fit within a predominant superstructure, as you call it, inside the United States that dates back 350 years. That's
True.
something that was identifiable. Okay, there have been people we've heard about, and we talk about the Metzgers. We talk about the growth of racist skinheads and the neo-Nazi movement of the 80s and the Christian identity movement. If you've ever seen the movie Blood in the Face, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most interesting and telling and sadly still relevant documentaries of the last 30 years. It's called Blood in the Face. Really recommend it.
Yes.
Came out, I want to say 91.
Early, around the time I was graduating high school. I know that.
Yeah, 91. So, but otherwise, to take terrorism and put it back into the confines of the historical context within which it was developed, terrorism was what a military force called the acts of its opponent when its opponent refused to engage in traditional gentlemanly battle on the battlefield, face-to-face, one-on-one. When your opponent was overmatched and undermanned and lacked the material support that you did and engaged in harassing actions like surreptitiously sneaking into your camp and blowing up your arsenal, going to your ammunitions dump and blowing that up, coming into the camp and surreptitiously assassinating the commander of the forces. These were called acts of terrorism because these were things that your opponent resorted to when they could not meet you face to face on the battlefield. Right? That's, as a military tactic, terrorism is a tactic. Terrorism is also a tactic for a political movement inside a situation like, let's just say you want liberation for the Irish people in Northern Ireland, and you're Catholic, and you feel like you shouldn't be dominated by Protestant overlords from the other island. And so what you do is you engage in a series of terrorist attacks against soft civilian and military targets to try and exact a political solution through military means.
Right.
That's if you think about Al-Qaeda, do we even remember, does anybody even remember this? Why did Osama bin Laden even start what he started with Al-Qaeda after, dispatching the Soviet Union with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? Why did all of a sudden Al-Qaeda metastasize, other than the more, nefarious things about the CIA and creating endless war and other things? But let's just do face value stuff. On face value, why did bin Laden turn Al-Qaeda against the United States?
Well, the face value there. Well, the face value there is because of the fact that there was so many Western fleet landing in Arab soil.
In Saudi Arabia.
In the
Holy Land. There were infidel troops in the Holy Land as a result of the Gulf War.
Yeah, Riyadh, basically.
Yes, stationed in Saudi Arabia. Why? This all has relevance today. Why is Qatar such a complicated issue now? This tiny little nation of Wahhabis that used to be called, Saudi Arabia used to call our Wahhabi brothers. Why is it such an issue now? Because CENTCOM is there. What is CENTCOM? That's Central Command. Funny, the Pentagon doesn't have, North America Command, NORTHCOM. That's not Central Command. You think that would be central to everything the Pentagon does? No, the Middle East is CENTCOM. That's the Central Command. Well, why is the largest air base outside of the United States located in Qatar? Because they can't be located in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because when they were located in Saudi Arabia, it sparked Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and the Saudi leadership said, we can't have you here because we don't know if we can control our own people, because basically we've spent the last 30 years ginning them up on Wahhabism, Wahhabism, it's the right way to say it, the Wahhabism, ginning them up on Wahhabism and being anti-Western, and now that you're here with your Western boots on the ground, we're in trouble, so you gotta go. And Qatar said, oh, no, you come over here, we'll take you. And this was the thing that sparked bin Laden in the first place. What was that? That was a political goal. He had an organization to achieve a political goal that then grew to the idea of ejecting the infidel from all Muslim lands. Why? Because bin Laden was attached to a narrative that said that basically the West has used, abused, and murdered Islamic people for their own financial interest. That's a political goal. Whether you agree with it or not, that assessment, whether you agree with their program or not, is not the point. The point is, as a terrorist organization like the PLO, we want to liberate the Palestinian people. Like, again, I said the IRA. How about ETA, the Basque separatists, fought for 30 years bombing in and around Spain to try and to liberate the Basque people from Spanish rule. Those are identifiable political agendas with aims and violence that is then justified within the idea of trying to exact some kind of political settlement to a conflict. That, to me, some guy who's angry, some loner, some lone wolf who drives a car and starts stabbing people, whether they're stabbing people because the people they're stabbing are Muslim or they're stabbing them because the people are not Muslim, is to me hard for me to pin down as terrorism. But because we're in not just a war on terrorism, we're in a war on terror. It's great to me. It is one of the great telling things of the last 15 years is how the war on terrorism so quickly became the war on terror. So not only do we have a war against a tactic that has been used probably as long as human beings have been organized into tribal units. I mean, I would assume going all the way back to early Homo sapiens in tribal units that there were acts of terrorism as different tribes competed over different places where they were trying to get access to food, to game, or to places where they were collecting, fruits and berries or whatever. Terrorism is like it's like the most logical thing that you can do when you are facing an enemy who is superior to you is to engage in acts of terrorism. So not only do we have a war against the tactic, so if you're going to fight a tactic, a war on terrorism, you're never going to stop that war. Now we're going to have a war on terror. Oh, we're going to have a war on an emotion.
Right.
Screw it. We're not just going to fight a tactic. We're going to fight an emotion. And so, as you so aptly pointed out, the guy at the UPS building over here in San Francisco terrorized some people for about 2 hours that day, killed a couple.
Right.
It wasn't terrorism, but if we have a war on terror, a war on a feeling, that is a war that literally will never end.
Well, right, and just the same way that I'm sure those congressmen on that baseball field were terrorized.
That's right.
It doesn't make it an act of terrorism. Right. See, there is that separation, and I think people fail to recognize the fact that, and I won't even call it the war on terror, it's the war of terror.
Yeah, that's right. One of the greatest moments from Sacha Baron Cohen. Oh my God, Borat. I mean, when he's there. I think it was in Montana or Wyoming. He's at a rodeo. He's playing the character Borat. He comes out and says to these people in the accent, we support George Bush. We support your war of terror. And everybody says, yay.
Right.
It's a perfect moment of satire because people do not understand that it is a war of terror. The United States is terrorizing people, and as a matter of fact, the Christmas Day bombing, which was one of the final massive bombing campaigns right before they reached an agreement to end the Vietnam War in Paris, that bombing was specifically designed to terrorize the Vietnamese people and civilians by laying waste to Hanoi,
right?
And it worked. And it worked, just like the V-2 rockets at the end of World War II that the Germans were firing into London, designed to terrorize. So terrorism as a tactic is a military tool. It is not an individual lashing out of in a momentary fit of insanity or a long-standing move towards a mental discombobulation or an act of vengeance or an act of rage or anger. That is not on its face terrorism.
No, and no political ideology, religious sect, nation state, or individual group of tribal people have the patent on this tactic. Okay? It's been utilized, as you said, since people have been organized into tribes, one way or another. This has been done when you're confronted with a superior force. Well, why is asymmetric warfare even a term? Because you can't do battle with them in the standard sense. So therefore, well, Vietnam. What can I say, right?
Well, Vietnam's a great example, too, that it's also when you have stalemate. Now, just in terms of like numbers, if you were to do aggregate counts and you look at the two forces, one would say, wow, what do you mean the American force? Why would they have to engage in asymmetrical war with Vietnam? Because they were losing. Body to body, we won. Right. It's that simple. But in terms of the way that the tactics translated strategically onto the battlefield, the Vietnamese kicked America's butt.
All over the place.
So, right? And why did they do it? Because at the beginning, they used terrorism tactics. They harassed, they disrupted. These are terrorism tactics. So look, I guess we're basically in agreement here. I know we're basically in agreement here. Of course we are. But I think it's really important for us to every time we hear of the word terrorism, look, it kind of gets to the whole Russiagate thing too in a funny way, because my continuing discomfort with the mainstream media or with particularly cable news is that they cannot walk and chew gum at the same time.
Oh yes.
And there is such a willingness to take a story and beat it into the ground unreflexively, without any circumspection, and just continue to go at it. And as you pointed out, the London thing happens, right? The Manchester attack happens. The London Bridge thing happens. And then the second London incident happens. And it's nonstop. It's nonstop. They got the image, the chyron that comes up, the super. When I say super, that's the title. We call it a super in television. The super comes up and it's, terror in London. Again,
yeah. Except now they turn it red,
and it's red, or it's usually a red, black, and white. If you look at anytime they really want to grab your attention, they use the color combination red, black, and white. Believe me, everybody learned, from the Nazis. You put red, white, and black together, and it sends a message to people. It says danger. It does. You want to go to a bookstore, go to a history section of a bookstore. Notice how all the books in the Nazi section, in the German 20th century history section, they're all red, black, and white. Why? Because it grabs your attention. So also a black, red, and yellow go well together too. That also says danger. So this constant drumbeat is on one level numbing us and on another level training us. And the same thing is happening with Russiagate. Look, I'm not shy about this. There's something there. Okay, I know there's something there. I haven't seen the proof. I don't know that we're ever going to see the actual chain of evidence that leads to Russian hacking. I think there's some real problems with the fact that CrowdStrike, which was the organization, the company that was hired by the DNC to handle their security, their cybersecurity, they're the ones who have basically, as far as we know, determined who did the hacking. I'm just going to assume based on the lockstep march of U.S. intelligence services, that they have a chain of evidence. They better have a chain of evidence, because if they don't, if this eventually comes out, it's actually almost going to be worse than Iraq. I say almost because this thing has not led to the destruction of a bystander nation under false pretenses the way that thing did. It has not led to the long-term destruction of many, many tens of thousands of families and the deaths of upwards of 1 million people over the course of the last 15 years, as the thing has spiraled out of control and created things like the Syrian war. So we can't say that it's comparable, but I don't know what's there, and I don't know if we're ever going to see what's there. And I'm actually not that interested. I'm much more interested, as everybody knows who listens, I'm much more interested in the money laundering and the real estate fraud. And I have I'm holding out hope that we're going to pull a string or pull a Jenga piece out of this tower, and a major system of corruption that goes across both parties, that really is endemic at the upper echelons, where government and private business interact and intermingle and turn into a revolving door. And Donald Trump is just an exemplar of that. It's turning out that Michael Flynn is an exemplar of that. Not only did he have deals with Turkey, was he doing deals with Russia? Now it turns out in the last 24 hours, he was trying to set up a nuclear power plant deal with the Saudis. None of these things he was disclosing on the proper, making proper disclosures of, or filling out the proper forms, that he was a foreign agent, and then he goes in to become national security advisor. So that's the stuff that I want to see uncovered. That's the most important stuff to me. But
I'd like to see the Turkish kidnapping thing kind of explored a little more too.
Right? I mean, look, Erdogan is one of these guys. Putin is one of these guys. The upper levels of Chinese leadership and the Politburo, the Communist Party, they have huge corruption problems they're trying to deal with. Pakistan is corrupt. I mean, here's one of the things that you find, and you know this as better than most anybody that in America. That if you look back at American foreign policy since the beginning of the Cold War has been one in which this interaction, this corruption between government officials and private business, and between third and second world petty dictatorships and so-called democracies, places where there are resources that corporations want access to, this is the kind of corruption that's been going on for 50, 60, 70 years, 75 years, frankly. And Donald Trump is an exemplar of that. That's what I want to see dealt with. But, as it relates to the media coverage of Russiagate, the fact that all we see now on television is talking heads talking about stuff that has already been established. They're not advancing the story. They're talking about stories that other people are reporting, or stuff that's been reported 2 days ago, and they're still talking about it today. And what is that doing? That's shutting out stories that need to be told about the war in Syria, about famine in Yemen, about things that America is involved in and is partially or in some cases mostly responsible for, that the American people know nothing about. And so when all you are is on a diet of terror and Russiagate and terror and Russiagate and terror and Russiagate, we wonder why people are becoming so tribal. Why are they becoming tribal? Because in a world that is totally discombobulated, that has no context, we see no context to understand that people in sub-Saharan Africa and people on the Indian subcontinent and people in the Rust Belt of America suffering from an opioid crisis. There's this new data point that just came out late this afternoon, and I put it it's going to be at the top of the rundown tomorrow, because I'm going to feature healthcare at the top. In 1 year, nearly 1.3 million Americans went into hospital care for opioid-related issues.
Right.
1.3 million. These are in impoverished areas. And if we had context and we had journalism going out, instead of beating the drum on terror, 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 and instead of enterprising stories on stuff that Trump is doing with corruption, just continuing to talk about the same old blah, 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 blah about Russiagate, and not going out and actually showing the context within which human beings live and may actually have things in common because they are struggling over the same things in places in the Rust Belt, in places in Sub-Saharan Africa, in places in India, in places in China. What do? We retrench into tribalism. And in a sense, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that in a funny kind of way actually only profits the people at the top who, as long as we are divided, can keep us conquered and turn us into essentially ATM machines.
Well, you know what? That's right. And here's the thing to remember. You bring up this opioid issue, and it is underreported. It is completely not something that is in the consciousness out there. You may have seen that data point somewhere. I guarantee you it's grossly understated. What's happening here is that we do have a nation which, quite honestly, has been so drugged in a legal way.
Yeah.
In a legal way, I'm sorry, but in a legal way, we have an entire industry which is basically impervious to any sort of issues. Okay. And they don't pay for it. There is no criminality to it. And people are dying. People are dying left and right. They are not dying from terrorism or terror or whatever it is you want to call it. They're not even dying from these mass shooting events as often as they are from needles in their arms and drugs they're taking that they've been prescribed.
That's such a great point. It is such a great point. The chances of you dying of an opioid overdose are just by an order of factor of 10 greater than dying in a terrorist attack. A terrorist attack is one of the, it's like a 1 in like 4.8 million chance that you're going to die of a terrorist attack. But people
let me just say this really quickly, JP, because this is very personal to me. The reason is, and I've even admitted on this show that before I started doing this show, I was completely hooked on painkillers. Okay? The soul-crushing reality of trying to extract yourself from that addiction is something that no one is talking about. Okay? This is the thing that is demoralizing and dehumanizing a huge portion of our population. And yet, we're going to talk about whether the immigrants that are coming in, maybe they have bad intentions. We're going to talk about the refugees that, to my knowledge, there is no documented case where refugees under a program have attacked U.S. citizens on a massive scale. No, but what has attacked us on a massive scale is the drug culture and big pharmaceutical companies in combination with the illicit drugs on the street, which, you know, we could have a discussion about that, but I don't have time. But in combination with those two things, we have seen a nation demoralized, and I don't mean from a nationalistic, I'm a great American. I'm talking about people to people. This destroys human beings. This destroys families. This kills people daily. Daily. So I apologize, but you know what?
No, it has to be said because the perfectly legal drug dealers have been basically extracting wealth out of the American people and out of the U.S., the American healthcare system, without any checks, without any balances, without any real oversight for the last 30 years. And it's not getting any better. It's not getting any better. It isn't. There's actually an amazing story today in ProPublica about how one company took a painkiller and Nexium and put them together under the idea that that if you take this painkiller, you may actually have a little bit of stomach upset. So we'll put the Nexium in it, and instead of taking 2 pills that would cost $6 if you took 2 pills, we're going to make it 1 pill, and we're actually going to charge your insurance company $1,000 a pill.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of profiteering, the kind of predatory profiteering that is going on in the pharmaceutical industry. And as you point out, how many people have died from any number of drug cocktails that they have been put on over the course of the last 30 years in a healthcare system that doesn't really do much to solve health problems. It just gives essentially palliative care in the form of pills, because that is where the profit margin is.
Well, right. And we're not even going to address the psychological industry, the psychopharmacology, if you will. Yeah. That's a whole other issue. But even people that have taken drugs as prescribed and don't seem to be, getting hooked on something to get high are dying from misadventures constantly. Not a peep comes out of anybody's mouth about this generally. Yes, I know occasionally there are stories run and whatever, but how much traction do they get? How much does anybody care about it seemingly? How much do the greater news agencies take it up? How much is it publicized? How much is it given to the people to consider, so that maybe, just maybe, we should put that in the context of what the government might want to do about health care? That is a factor here. And it affects, it's not just young people, it's not just old people, it's everywhere now, JP. Anyway, we're almost out of time. I feel like I could do a whole show.
That was an odd hour, wasn't it? Boy, we went from point A to point Q on that one.
Well, we did, but you know what? All of this stuff is related, because it is the focus on certain things which I do consider to be weapons of mass distraction, as opposed to the things that are truly relevant to people. That is important. That's why I'm doing this, because you know what? This is what's relevant from what I can see. This is what makes sense from what I can see. And I know that when you put together news sources and everything else, even when you're just doing the rundown, which is, again, a great thing that you can sign up for free at newsvandal.com. When you're putting that together, you can see the greater landscape. And if you use it, you, the listener, can also see the greater landscape. But I'm telling you now, even in that greater landscape, consider the whole of the picture. You're still not getting everything. Not you, JP. I'm saying the listener, the public. You're not getting at the real stories, the real things that are actually threatening you. You're just being threatened with the boogeymen that they've approved, and being told that some of the real boogeymen aren't really your enemy. True. So that's the thing that I like to keep in mind. And, like I say again, man, I love having you on this show. And I'm sorry, I kind of twist you in different directions, but
come on, Chuck.
Well, we always get into a conversation that is not standard. It's not the typical fare. And I appreciate you having the patience with me, because, I can be a bit off in a few different directions, but I think it was extremely valuable to break down what we broke down today. So, I thank you again, JP, for joining us. Of course, as I said, go to newsvandal.com. Anytime you see JP Sottille's name on a byline, click on it, read the story, because I'm going to tell you something else. When JP writes an article, he does take the time to consider many different angles that, I swear to you, others that call themselves journalists, JP is a journalist, but others that call themselves journalists do not bother to recognize, acknowledge, or even begin to examine. JP does, and that's why I love this guy. So I'm going to give you the final word here, man. It's like maybe 40 seconds left, but, how is it that we should walk away from this particular hour, JP Sottile?
If you want to avoid falling into traps, you have to keep your eyes open and your mind open, and you have to look at multiple sources. That's just the bottom line. You actually have to do the work, because if you leave the work to other people, they're going to work you over.
That's the bottom line. Yeah, I love that. I might actually steal that, JP. If you leave the work to other people, they might work you over. The Ochelli Effect is done for a Tuesday night, but I do appreciate all you guys for tuning in. JP Sottile for being with me in the second hour. Michael Swanson in the first. You can't get 2 hours that are going to be more loaded with information and analysis than what it is these two gentlemen bring to the show every single week. So thank you again, JP Sottile.
Ciao.
And please stay tuned to the stream if you like, or the network you're listening to. Support those who give you the right to get at the real information, because they are working hard to do it. Everybody have a good night, and do your best to not embrace fear or the war of terror. Take care.